I would like to speak to you today about a paper I've been developing for a Critical Perspectives on Accounting special issue on accounting, accountability and animals. My current working title is Wild Animals as Performance Objects in a Big Three Conservation NGO. This paper aims to contribute to extant literature on NGO accountability. It is striking that whilst Gray, Bennington and Cuckston 2006 recognised the centrality of NGO accountability to the capabilities of civil society for collective action, subsequent literature on NGO accountability does not appear to have meaningfully built upon this observation or sought to conceptualise the link between NGO accountability and NGO agency. That is the capability of an NGO to act to address fundamental challenges in society, such as wildlife conservation. Indeed, much of the extant literature seems to focus on categorizing various forms of NGO accountability. Probably the most basic distinction here is between so-called upwards accountability to an NGO's supporters, that is its current or potential donors, funders, members, etc., and so-called downwards accountability to an NGO's beneficiaries, those people who benefit from the services provided by the NGO. The focus in this paper is on upwards accountability, accountability to an NGO's supporters. Extant literature has largely characterized this as a kind of fiduciary accountability, with the focus being on ensuring transparency around how money is being spent, where researchers have looked at annual reports of NGOs. These have been analysed as being partly about the discharge of fiduciary accountability and partly about legitimation, ensuring that an NGO is seen to be acting within the norms and expectations of the society to which its supporters belong. However, surveys and interview studies of NGO supporters have shown that supporters are primarily concerned with an NGO's performance in respect of its pursuit of its objectives. So relatedly, interview studies of NGO managers show that managers are aware of this demand for performance-related accountability from their supporters. So one manager puts it simply, supporters want to know that they're making a difference. Given this, we have to question whether legitimation really provides us with a full picture of what's going on in NGO annual reports. Consequently, this paper will analyse the annual reports of an NGO not as an amalgamation of fiduciary accountability and legitimation practices, but rather as a way for the NGO to discharge accountability to supporters for its performance. But how can we understand and conceptualize this discharge of performance accountability? In profit-seeking corporations, performance is pretty straightforward. Primarily, it's about producing financial returns for shareholders. Of course, social and environmental reporting does try and bring in other dimensions of performance into an organization's reporting. But for NGOs, performance is a more difficult thing to account for. How do you provide an account of the difference you have made in addressing whatever societal problems that you are seeking to address? In the language of Michel Canon, we, as well as accounting scholars like Miller and Power, how can an NGO render its performance calculable? So the research question in this paper is, how does an NGO annual report frame a calculable space in which the organisation can discharge accountability to its supporters for its performance in pursuit of its objectives? In order to try and answer this question, I have analysed the annual reports for the financial years 2013 to 2018 of WWF UK. WWF describes itself as the world's leading independent conservation organisation. It is one of the big three conservation NGOs, alongside Conservation International and the Nature Conservancy. WWF has approximately 5 million members globally, each paying a subscription to support the organisation's work. In its 2013-18 strategy document, WWF UK described its primary objective as being to restore wildlife. So how does WWF UK use its annual reports to frame a space in which its performance in pursuit of this objective is rendered calculable? As you can see, images of wild animals feature prominently on the front covers of all annual reports in this period. The argument in this paper goes that wild animals are rendered into performance objects for WWF UK in the sense that they are objectified in the annual reports in ways that enable WWF to frame a space in which its performance in respect of restoring wildlife is rendered calculable. To explain how this is achieved, the annual reports have been subjected to a discourse analysis using Michel Calon's 3 problems of framing a space of calculability as a guiding heuristic. The basic idea of Calon's calculability framework is that material devices can be assembled in ways that effectively frame a space in which an actor is able to clearly identify those things that are to be brought into account in calculations or judgments, and conversely those things that are to be left out. In this way, the world inside the frame is rendered calculable, such that it can be seen and understood in ways that make calculation and action based on such calculation possible. Calon identifies 3 problems that must be addressed in the framing of a space of calculability. The first concerns identifying the material object that is being brought into account. That is, what is it that is being accounted for? In respect of how the WWF UK annual reports frame a space of calculability for its performance in restoring wildlife, this problem concerns how wildlife is being objectified in these annual reports. The second problem concerns identifying the relations between this object and the rest of the world that are being brought into account. That is, what agents are understood to be acting upon this object. In respect of WWF UK, this problem concerns how the annual reports represent the relations between the subjectified wildlife and the agents, including WWF UK, that are understood to be acting on it in ways that affect both positively and negatively its restoration. The third problem concerns identifying a metrological framework to quantify and measure the effect that these relations are having on the material object. How are we to understand the extent of the effect of an agent's actions upon the object? In respect of WWF UK, this problem concerns how the effects of the relation between wildlife and WWF UK are to be quantified and measured. These 3 problems have been used to guide the discourse analysis of the WWF UK annual reports. In respect of Calon's first problem, concerning for the case of WWF UK, how wildlife is being objectified in the annual reports, it's useful to look to the 2013-18 strategy document to understand how the restoring wildlife objective is being elaborated. How does this objective delineate wildlife, the wildlife that is to be restored? The strategy document explains this objective in the following terms. It says populations of 10 of the world's most iconic and threatened species are safeguarded. Our focus will be on tigers and other species in Asia, Amur leopards, snow leopards, Javan rhinos, orangutans, freshwater dolphins and porpoises, and giant pandas. Elsewhere, the key species we'll support include black rhinos in Africa and polar bears in the Arctic. In each of the subsequent annual reports from 2014 to 2018, WWF UK includes a section reporting on its achievements and performance against this objective of restoring wildlife. Each report contains information on 2 or 3 of these species What can we note about the objectification of wildlife here? Well, all 10 species identified as being iconic in this objective are large mammals. They are also animals, all animals from terrestrial habitats, if we include rivers, with no animals from marine habitats. We can also see that 8 out of the 10 are native to Asia. One is from Africa, and one is in the Arctic. So there are no animals here from Europe, North or South America, or Antarctica. And there is an interesting juxtaposition here with the WWF's own Living Planet report, which represents their account of the state of nature on Earth. This report shows how, whilst mammal populations are declining, there are other groups that are considerably more threatened. So amphibians and corals in particular are suffering extremely severe declines, with many species facing extinction. Yet these animals aren't included here. Likewise, the WWF's own Living Planet report shows that the region suffering the greatest decline in wildlife populations is South America, with an estimated 89% decline in vertebrate populations between 1970 and 2014. It's also worth noting here that these species, whilst all listed as threatened on the IUCN Red List, do face a range of levels of extinction risk. So the orangutans and the 2 species of rhino are critically endangered, but the others are listed at the lower threat levels of endangered or vulnerable. The focus on these large mammals is further emphasized in the extensive use of photographs of animals in these reports. We saw earlier that the front cover of each report displays a portrait photograph of a large mammal. There are further portrait-style photographs within the reports themselves, especially around the achievements and performance section. These photographs highlight the charismatic appeal of these animals. They invite us to feel a sense of awe and reverence for these animals. An interesting outlier is the photograph of snow leopard tracks in the 2017 report, perhaps connoting a sense of these animals being elusive and enigmatic. Interestingly, there's very little context added in the text of these reports about these animals. There is very little information about the ecology or ethology of these animals. They're also not in any way anthropomorphized. There are no named individuals or indeed any stories of individual animals. The object here, therefore, is very much the species as a whole, not individual animals. It is the conservation of these threatened species that is being held up here as defining performance for WWF UK. In respect of Callan's second problem, concerning, in this case, how the annual reports represent the relations between this objectified wildlife and the agents that are understood to be acting upon it, it's useful to look at how these reports talk about the threats posed against these animals. By far the most prominent threat talked about in these reports is poaching and wildlife crime. WWF talks about the world facing a poaching crisis. So there is a relation established between these animals and criminals who are killing them for personal profit. Again, there is a juxtaposition here between the annual reports and the WWF's Living Planet report, which highlights habitat loss and degradation as the most significant threat facing the planet's wildlife. Having established this detrimental relation between wildlife and criminals, WWF UK are able to represent their own conservation efforts in terms of thwarting this criminality. Thus, there's extensive talk of working with national governments to establish legal protections for wildlife reserves and strengthening enforcement of these protections. This is emphasized in a recurring theme in photographs of wildlife rangers dressed in military style uniforms, armed with guns, and using binoculars to keep watch over the animals. In this way, WWF UK presents its own relation with this objectified wildlife as that of a kind of protection force, policing these protective reserves, and fighting the evils of wildlife crime. In respect of Callum's third problem, concerning, in this case, how the effects of the relation between wildlife and WWF UK are being quantified and measured in the annual reports, there is a strong emphasis throughout these reports on population numbers. We are told, for example, in the 2017 report that the Javan rhino population has increased from 63 to 67 in 2015, and in the 2016 report that wild tiger numbers have increased globally for the first time in conservation history, with estimates at around 3,900 compared to 3,200 6 years ago. Interestingly, this focus on population numbers is also projected into the future. So we're told that WWF has a 12-year goal to help double wild tiger numbers. Even more explicitly, we're told in the 2018 report that WWF has supported Kenya's government to develop a 2017 to 21 black rhino action plan aimed at increasing Kenya's black rhino population to 830 by 2021, with an annual growth rate of 5% in areas that have established populations. There is a lot of emphasis throughout the reports on the efforts made to survey and monitor these animal populations. So we're told about camera trapping and WWF providing technical support for large-scale surveys. This emphasis on monitoring is further highlighted in photographs depicting these monitoring efforts. These images include images of animals taken by camera traps, staged photographs of people operating camera traps, or photographs of people engaged in other kinds of monitoring and measurement work on animals. In this way, WWF UK represents the extent of the effect of its relation as protector of these iconic wild animals. Population numbers are presented both as an achievement in itself, a result of meticulous technical work, and also as a measure of WWF's performance in its conservation efforts. So in my analysis of these annual reports, I've sought to identify how WWF UK has made numerous discursive devices in its annual reports to frame a space in which its own performance in pursuit of their objective of restoring wildlife is rendered calculable. In this way, we can see the NGO annual report as a mechanism for enabling calculation and judgment by supporters of an NGO as to the performance of this NGO. With this capability, supporters or potential supporters are able to decide whether to commence or maintain their support. I suggest that it is this form of accountability, this accountability for performance, that enables an NGO to mobilize people to support and finance their work. We may thus see the annual report of an NGO as a mechanism for framing a space that enables this kind of calculated collective action within civil society to address societal challenges, such as, in this case, wildlife conservation.